Oprah Winfrey has now injected herself into the race controversy surrounding the George Zimmerman verdict, saying this.
Emmitt Till became a symbol for those times, as Trayvon Martin has become a symbol for this time. A lot of people, if they think they're not using the N-word themselves, they actually physically are not using the N-word themselves and do not have harbor ill will towards black people, that it's not racist. But, you know, to me, it's ridiculous to look at that case and to not to think that race was involved.
Joining us now to react from Los Angeles, UCLA professor Mark Sawyer, and here in the studio, Horace Cooper. He's a senior fellow at the Heartland Institute, a conservative organization. All right, gentlemen, this is pretty interesting. I'm going to start with you, Professor Sawyer, because Oprah Winfrey, obviously one of the most recognizable, most successful women in the world, not just in the United States, right? She's a billionaire. She came from very difficult upbringing. She's told her personal story. It's so compelling. And yet, to hear her in this interview, you would think that racism is really still a fairly prevalent problem in the United States, while we have a black president and Oprah herself as a huge draw for white audiences. What's your reaction to what she said?
My reaction to what she said is it's very accurate. It's an accurate description of the case. I mean, the idea that there's some successful black people who do very well doesn't mean that racism doesn't exist and people don't still harbor those views. We've seen the rodeo clown and we've saw the words of Paula Deen and a bunch of other people. We see what people say on Twitter and what they say in comments on columns. So, you know, we know that racism exists. Their success is in contradiction to our ugly history of racism.
Well, first of all, the Paula Deen, there's been some developments in that case, number one. Number two, the rodeo clown, I mean, that's a whole separate issue. I'm not sure that's going to be a commentary on all of American culture, given the fact that there are presidential masks all over the country at all points in time, and people didn't really make a big deal of it. But number three, Oprah Winfrey knows more than the sitting jury in the Trayvon Martin case that actually heard all of the evidence, all of the testimony, and that it include minorities on the jury. I mean, how does Oprah Winfrey make that commentary when she didn't sit through the case?
I mean, one doesn't have to sit through every single moment of the case to conclude that racism and race had something to do with it. Some of the jurors said they couldn't identify with Trayvon Martin. They identified with George Zimmerman. They couldn't feel empathy for him or his loss. Those things are part of what, you know, as a social scientist, you know, I just know from experimentation tend to happen in people's minds when they interact with or see black people.
Okay, wait a second there.
Horace, go ahead.
This isn't accurate. In fact, none of the jurors actually said anything like they couldn't empathize with Trayvon Martin. In fact, they said just the opposite. But the problem here is this. The question isn't, does racism exist or does racism not exist? The question is, how relevant is that in impacting what goes on in the real lives of most Americans, black and white? And it is irrelevant. It's not the number one issue. It's not the number two issue. It's not even the number 10 issue. Family formation and educational attainment have far more to do with what happens in the lives of not just black Americans, but everyone in America.
And she also made a comment, Horace, about the N-word. She said that like she doesn't use the N-word because she identifies with the past use of it and what it meant historically to black people. And yet she said she understands, quote, understands why it's used currently. I guess she was referring to hip-hop and so forth. I mean, Oprah Winfrey could have an enormous impact, I think, on the hip-hop community by leading the charge against the dehumanizing language, not just the N-word, but the C-word, the W-word, the S-word, the F-word. But she chose to say, well, I understand, although I wouldn't use it personally.
There's a lot of cognitive dissonance when it comes to this whole question of what happens with the so-called N-words use. People like Mr. Obama, people like Oprah Winfrey, if they were wanting to lead, they would help push that word outside of the scope of normal discourse, even if it means calling out the Kanye West or these other so-called hip people, telling everyone it's never appropriate. But again, even the use of the N-word isn't a factor in deciding whether or not people are going to attain their objectives. It's not a function of the unemployment rate. It's not a function of the wealth and asset creations that are occurring in black and white America.
Emmitt Till and the Trayvon Martin case, I think that really kind of took me aback, Professor. Do you think the Emmitt Till case, given what that meant to black people, where a young man was systematically murdered for his supposed role in this controversy down in the South back in the late 50s, that's the same as Trayvon Martin?
First of all, let me correct some things. Resume studies have shown that names that appear associated with African Americans or addresses, they're less likely to get a call back for a job. There's disparities in income, there's disparities in wealth. And so this idea that race is irrelevant in people's lives is just nonsense. We see health disparities, we see disparities in every single field of life. We see disparities in input in terms of education. Now, whether the cases are not exactly the same, but it's sort of similar. I mean, you can see how the symbolism is similar. The idea of a young black man, a black child, a young kid who goes out and is out and about, going about his business, no criminal intent whatsoever, and doesn't come home and ends up dead, resonates with the community. It resonates with the community.
It's
you can cut me off if you want, but it does.
It isn't even close. It isn't even close. Emmitt Till was completely and totally innocent, having nothing to do with any of the incident whatsoever. In this case, Mr. Martin and Mr. Zimmerman, a lot of the choices made by Mr. Martin's family and Mr. Martin led to the outcome in that rendezvous that night.
Wait. What did Mr. Martin's family do to cause this incident?
Helpful for people to make this statement.
But I wish that Oprah Winfrey would address other issues. If she's going to get into this, like the 3 black boys who beat up that white kid, and
absolutely, all these leaders need to be doing that.
If justification,
equal time for every group.
Nonsense and horrible.
It would be good for her to address those types of issues as well, and she could lead on that. She'd have a great role if she could. And next on the rundown.